Section 1. The Voice That Shook the World. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the sky over Skyrim. Not the sky as you know it from cities or warm places, but the sky over Skyrim specifically. Heavy, gray, enormous. Clouds that roll in from the sea of ghosts like slow-moving fortresses, bruised purple at the edges, lit from within by the kind of lightning that doesn't just flash but lingers, stitching itself across the horizon in long, silver threads. The wind doesn't merely blow here. It announces itself. It fills the valleys like a voice filling a hall. It moves through the pine forests and comes out the other side changed, carrying the smell of pine sap and cold stone and something older that doesn't have a name. And somewhere above all of that, above the clouds and the lightning and the reaching tops of the tallest trees, sits a mountain that the Nords call the Throat of the World. The Throat of the World is not merely the highest peak in Skyrim. It is not even simply the highest mountain in all of Tamriel, though it is that too. It is a place that carries weight, the way ancient things carry weight, not in size or mass alone, but in what has happened there, in what those rocks and those frozen slopes have witnessed. It is a place where mortal men once stood shoulder to shoulder with a dragon and sent a god tumbling through time itself. It is a place where a lone warrior spent 7 years in silence, turning an impossible defeat into a philosophy that would echo across thousands of years. And it is a place where, right now, in the lore of Skyrim, 5 of the most powerful beings on the face of Nirn sit in absolute quiet, choosing not to speak because the words they know would bend reality if carelessly spoken. Those beings are the Greybeards. In the world of Skyrim, the Greybeards occupy a strange and almost paradoxical position. They are simultaneously the most powerful and the most restrained. They are ancient beyond easy reckoning, and yet somehow still very much alive and present. The province of Skyrim shivers with civil war, with dragon attacks, with political chaos and religious persecution, and up on their mountain, the Greybeards sit in silence. They don't intervene. They don't choose sides. They don't send armies or write declarations. They simply study. They meditate. They breathe in the thin, cold air at the top of the world and turn the force of existence itself into something quiet and internal. When the Dragonborn is finally called to High Hrothgar, the monastery where the Greybeards make their home, the summoning alone is enough to make every guard in every city in Skyrim stop and look up. Common people step outside their homes, shading their eyes against the pale light, trying to figure out where that sound came and what it means. Jarls gather their advisors. Soldiers on the road go still, because the Greybeards spoke a name, one name, barely above a whisper in the grand scheme of what they're capable of, and it rang through stone and sky like the tolling of a bell the size of a mountain. That is who these people are. That is the weight they carry, and the story of how they came to exist, who they really are, what philosophy drives them, and what they represent in the deep bones of Elder Scrolls lore that is a story worth sitting with on a quiet night. So let's go back, way back, past the Civil War and the Dragon Crisis and the political games of the Fourth Era, past even the Greybeards themselves. Let's go back to a time when the voice was just a weapon, when men shouted their enemies apart without a second thought, and when the mountain that would eventually hold high, Hrothgar had never yet heard the sound of human contemplation echoing off its walls. Let's go back to when the world was younger and far more violent, and the dragons ruled everything under the sky. Drop a comment below telling me where you are and what time it is while you're listening to this. It could be midnight in your bedroom, early morning with a coffee, or on a long drive somewhere quiet. And if this kind of content helps you relax or learn something new, subscribing means you'll never miss one of these. It means a lot. Section 2. When Dragons Ruled the Sky, the Merethic Era. To understand the Greybeards, you have to understand what the world looked like before there were Greybeards. And to understand that, you have to understand what it felt like to live in a world where dragons were not just dangerous creatures you encountered occasionally in the wilderness, but literal gods, rulers. The organizing principle around which all of civilization in ancient Skyrim was built. We're talking about the Merethic Era, that vast, largely undocumented stretch of time before the First Era began, before calendars, before empires, before any of the institutions that give the world structure and memory. This was the age that Nords call the Dragon Cult Era, and it was not a metaphorical name. There genuinely was a cult. and those dragons genuinely were treated as divine. In the beginning of recorded myth, before even the memory of most races stretches, the dragons existed as the first children of Akatosh, the dragon god of time, the chief among the 8 divines, the primordial force that gives shape and direction to the flow of existence. The dragons didn't just arrive in the world, they were woven into it at a fundamental level. Their language, Dovazul, wasn't something they invented to communicate. It was the language in which reality itself was originally spoken into being. When a dragon speaks a word for fire, it isn't describing fire or requesting fire or gesturing toward the concept of fire. The word is fire. The utterance and the phenomenon are the same thing, unified in the throat and the will of the creature speaking. That's a staggering idea, and it matters enormously for everything that follows in this story. The dragons weren't powerful despite what they said. They were powerful because of what they said. Language and reality weren't separate for them. They were one and the same. And so these creatures ruled Skyrim. They ruled it not just through force, though they had force in quantities that mortals couldn't dream of. They ruled it through a kind of cosmic authority. The ancient Nords genuinely believed with good reason, given the evidence available to them, that dragons deserved worship simply by virtue of what they were. The dragon cult was the organized expression of that belief. A theocracy built around the worship of these magnificent, terrifying, language-made flesh creatures who controlled the skies and commanded the ancient tongues. The dragon priests were, in this early period, not the skeletal horrors you find lurking in Nordic ruins in the game. They were something closer to respected intermediaries. They stood between the dragon lords and the mortal population, carrying messages and commands and blessings. The arrangement wasn't purely oppressive at the start, or at least that's what the surviving texts suggest. Dragons offered protection and arcane knowledge. Humans offered tribute and worship. A terrible bargain, perhaps, by any modern moral standard, but a stable one, after a fashion, for a time. Then, something changed. The exact mechanism of that change is disputed in Elder Scrolls lore, and honestly, that ambiguity is part of what makes the mythology so rich. Some texts suggest Alduin's corruption was the cause that the World Eater's growing ambition and increasingly tyrannical demands filtered down through the hierarchy of the dragon cult and twisted it into something cruel. What had been an uncomfortable but functional arrangement became something darker. The dragon priests began demanding sacrifices. They enforced increasingly brutal laws. The balance tipped from exploitation with benefit to exploitation without even the pretense of mutual gain. And eventually, the Nords had enough. The Dragon War was not a single battle. It was a long, grinding, devastating conflict that played out across what is now Skyrim, fought by men and women who learned to use the same weapon their oppressors wielded the voice against the creatures who had treated it as their exclusive domain. That learning process, that moment when mortals first spoke in the dragon tongue and felt the world shift around them in response, is one of the pivotal events in all of Tamriel's history. And the being responsible for making it possible is the same dragon who currently sits at the summit of the throat of the world, meditating in silence, waiting for a worthy conversation, but will come to Paarthurnax in his own time. What matters right now is this. The Nords learned the thu'um. They learned it imperfectly, slowly, at enormous cost, years of study, of meditation, of burning themselves from the inside out, trying to align their mortal souls with the ancient cosmic power of Dovazul. But they learned it, and they used it. They stood on the same ground as the dragons, looked up at those vast, scaled bodies, and they shouted, and the dragons fell. The first great tongues, the humans who mastered the voice well enough to be genuinely dangerous in the Dragon War, were revered figures. Gormlaith Goldenhilt, who was as fierce and reckless as anyone in Nordic legend. Hakon One-Eye, a warrior whose shouts are still spoken of with something approaching awe thousands of years later. And Felder the Old, whose wisdom and terrible foresight saved the world even as it guaranteed the world would one day need saving again. These three eventually faced Alduin himself at the peak of the throat of the world. The battle was beyond anything the mortal mind can fully grasp even now, reading about it in fragments. Gormlaith fell. Alduin, even driven to the ground by Dragonrend, a shout forged specifically to force the concept of mortality into a creature that had never understood it was more than they could kill. The World Eater was too strong, too fundamental, too woven into the structure of existence to simply die on that mountain. So Feldir did the other thing. He used an Elder Scroll, one of those impossible, reality-bending artifacts that exist outside of normal cause and effect, and he didn't destroy Alduin. He sent him somewhere else. Specifically, he sent him into the future. He spoke words older than any word wall, older than any recorded shout, and tore a hole in the flow of time itself, and pushed Alduin through it. And where that tearing happened, at the very summit of the throat of the world, a wound was left behind, a time wound, as the lore calls it. A place where time itself is thin and strange, where past and present overlap in ways they shouldn't, where you can read an Elder Scroll and watch a battle that happened thousands of years ago as though it's happening 3 feet in front of you. That place didn't heal. It never did. The throat of the world became, from that moment forward, more than just the highest mountain. It became a scar on the face of time, a monument to what mortals are capable of when desperation and courage meet in exactly the right proportion. And it was on that mountain, in the shadow of that monument, that Jurgen Windcaller eventually came to build his home. Section 3. The Man Who Changed Everything, Jurgen Windcaller. There is something genuinely moving about the story of Jurgen Windcaller when you sit with it long enough. He was not, when we first encounter him in the historical record, a philosopher. He was not a monk or a mystic or a man given to long hours of quiet contemplation. He was a warrior, one of the greatest tongues of his age, and there were a lot of great tongues in the early First Era, because after the Dragon War, the voice had become a standard feature of Nordic military culture. Warriors trained in shouts, the way other cultures trained in swordsmanship or archery. It was a tool, formidable and respected, and the best practitioners of it were famous men and women whose names appear repeatedly in the sagas. Jurgen Windcaller's name appears as often as any. He was known, before his transformation, as a war leader of considerable power. He used his voice as a weapon and a way to grow in strength, as the texts put it casually, the way you'd describe a man who lifts stone to build muscle. The thu'um was his instrument, and he played it like a soldier. Then came the Battle of Red Mountain. The precise date places this around the year 700 of the First Era, though the exact timing is disputed in Elder Scrolls scholarship, and honestly, the exact date matters less than the shape of what happened. A large force of Nordic tongues, warriors trained in the voice and supremely confident in their power, engaged in a battle at Red Mountain in what is now Morrowind, and they lost, catastrophically. The army that should have won the army, with the power of Dovazul behind it, the army of masters whose voices could shake mountains, was annihilated. For Jurgen Windcaller, this was not merely a military defeat. It was a philosophical crisis of the highest order. Think about what this meant. You've built your entire understanding of yourself and your power around a certain set of beliefs. The voice is the greatest force available to mortals. Mastery of the thu'um makes you nearly invincible. The strongest tongue is the most powerful being on any battlefield. And then reality contradicts you, clearly and brutally and without apology. The army that embodied all of those beliefs was destroyed. The question was, why? And the answer that Jurgen eventually arrived at after 7 years of meditation and contemplation, 7 years of silence in which he turned the question over and over in his mind, examining it from every angle, refusing easy answers and comforting falsehoods, was not what anyone expected. He concluded that the gods had punished the Nords for their arrogant and blasphemous misuse of the voice. Not that they were simply outmaneuvered tactically, not that the enemy was stronger on that particular day, not that it was bad luck or unfortunate circumstance. He concluded that the gift of the thu'um, something given to mortals by Kine herself, the goddess of the storm, and the widow of Shor, the mother of all Nords, was being profaned. It was being used for glory, for conquest, for the aggrandizement of mortal ambition, and that use was itself a violation of what the voice was supposed to be. The voice was not meant for the glory of men, he decided. It was meant for the glory and worship of the gods. True mastery of the voice could only be achieved when your inner spirit was in harmony with your outward actions. Using it as a weapon of war casually, routinely, as though it were no different from a sword, was not just morally wrong, it was spiritually destructive. It corrupted the gift itself. This was a radical position. It didn't just contradict the current practice of his culture. It called into question the last several hundred years of Nordic military and social tradition. It said that everything the tongues had been doing since the Dragon War training for battle, using their shouts in combat, treating the voice as the ultimate weapon, had been a fundamental misunderstanding of what they'd been given. As you might imagine, this went over poorly. The historical record notes that Jurgen's early years of preaching the way of the voice, as he came to call his new philosophy, were marked by vigorous opposition. Other tongues confronted him. Powerful men who had built careers and reputations around the martial use of the thu'um challenged his ideas, sometimes literally attempting to defeat him in contests of power to prove that the old ways still worked. None of them succeeded. Whatever you think about the theology, the practical reality was undeniable. Jurgen Windcaller's mastery of the voice, refined through 7 years of pure contemplative practice rather than battlefield use, was simply staggering. He eventually overcame all opposition, not through conquest but through sheer undeniable demonstration. His mastery was so complete, so calm, so centered, that the argument against it became increasingly difficult to sustain. He called his philosophy the way of the voice, and the core of it was beautifully simple, if enormously difficult to actually live. The thu'um is a sacred gift from Kine. It is to be used only in worship of the gods, only in the pursuit of spiritual truth, and only in absolute necessity when nothing else will do. Not for war, not for politics, not for personal gain, and certainly not casually, the way a soldier uses a crossbow. Jurgen eventually retreated to the throat of the world. He built, or caused to be built, a monastery at a place called High Hrothgar, a name that translates roughly as High Hall of the Wind King, partway up the mountain slope, but still enormously high, still above the tree line, still in that zone of thin air and permanent snow where the world feels distant and the sky feels close. And there, with his first followers, he began to live out the philosophy he'd spent 7 years developing. He maintained that home until his death. Whenever that was, the sources are vague on the date, which feels appropriate for a man who spent his life resisting the idea that mortal things should dominate what is essentially a spiritual practice. When he died, he was buried in a tomb called Ustengrav, in the marshes of Hjalmarch. His sarcophagus has his name carved on it in the Daedric alphabet, which sounds like a strange choice for a man whose spiritual tradition is thoroughly Nordic, but the Elder Scrolls universe is full of small ironies like that. And the most remarkable thing about what he left behind is not the monastery or the writings or the philosophy itself. It is the relationship he formed with a creature who was already ancient when Jurgen was born, and who would still be there thousands of years after Jurgen was gone. Section 4. High Hrothgar and the 7,000 Steps. Before we go deeper into the lore, let's pause for a moment with the physical place where all of this happens. High Hrothgar sits partway up the throat of the world, which the dragons call Monavein, meaning Mother Wind in Dovazul. It sits above the clouds on most days. The air up there is the kind of air that requires adjustment. It doesn't hurt exactly, but it reminds you with every breath that you are not designed for this altitude, that the lungs are working harder than they're meant to, that you are a creature of lower ground who has wandered somewhere you don't quite belong. The monastery itself is built from enormous blocks of dark stone. Not the bright quarried limestone of southern architecture, not the carved and decorated stone of elven ruins, but something heavier and older looking, the color of an overcast sky. The walls are thick enough to muffle even the most violent of mountain storms, and the interior, when you see it in the game, has a quality of stillness that feels almost aggressive. Like the absence of sound isn't just the absence of noise, but an active thing, a presence unto itself. Inside High Hrothgar, banners hang from the stone walls carrying phrases in the dragon language. Loch bow, meaning roughly sky, above a greeting, an acknowledgement of the heavens, and thu'um, which is a rather beautiful play on words that means voice honor. The Greybeards honor the voice honors them. The two are inseparable. The path that leads up to High Hrothgar is called the 7,000 Steps, and the lore around it is itself worth sitting with. The Nords treat climbing the 7,000 steps as an act of pilgrimage. Not a casual hike, not a scenic route, a genuinely spiritual undertaking. The reason for this is rooted in Norse-flavored Nordic theology. The throat of the world is considered Kine's sacred mountain. The myth says that when the world was young, Kine breathed life into humanity at the very summit of this mountain. She exhaled at the top of the world, and mankind came into being. The rain that falls on Skyrim, in Nordic belief, is Kine weeping for shore, her husband who died to make the mortal world possible. There is real grief built into the landscape here, a sadness that the Nords don't run from, but walk toward. So, climbing the mountain is walking toward the place where your own existence began. In a theological sense, it's a way of reconnecting with origin. The pilgrims who undertake the journey often stop at a series of 10 carved stone tablets placed along the path, each one containing a lesson about the voice and the way. Reading all 10, the lore tells us, grants a blessing called Voice of the Sky, an effect that causes animals to neither attack nor flee from you for a full day, as though the mountain itself is confirming your peaceful intent. The steps themselves, practically speaking, number around 700 to 800 in the actual game geometry, a discrepancy from the legendary 7,000 that has become one of Skyrim's most beloved running jokes among players. Todd Howard reportedly joked in interviews that he would personally count every step to make sure they were all there. A dedicated player eventually did count them and found approximately 748. Walking 7,000 actual footsteps from the top of the mountain will, it turns out, deposit you in the center of Whiterun. None of this diminishes the myth. Because here's the thing about myths and sacred numbers. The 7,000 isn't meant to be counted, it's meant to be felt. It describes not the literal number of stone risers, but the weight of the journey, the effort of the ascent, the accumulation of thought and breath and muscle burn that happens between the bottom and the top. 7,000 is a way of saying, this will cost you something real. Come prepared to spend it. And when you finally arrive at High Hrothgar, after the frost trolls and the ice wraiths and the howling wind and the gradual disappearance of any tree or grass or living thing from the landscape around you, what greets you is that silence. That enormous, weighted, deliberate silence of men who have chosen to stop filling the world with words. The architecture of High Hrothgar is itself a kind of argument. Everything is built low and solid, close to the mountain. Nothing reaches upward in the way that other religious structures try to reach. No spires, no towers, no ambitious verticality. It says, we are already high enough. The mountain itself is the spire. We don't need to add to it. We are simply here, at the place where the sky begins, doing the quiet work of listening to what the wind is trying to tell us. It was in this place that Jurgen Windcaller died and left behind his philosophy and his 4 human successors, and, above all else, his extraordinary relationship with an ancient dragon who had been carrying guilt and purpose in equal measure since long before the First Era began. Section 5. The Men of the Throat, who are the Greybeards. By the time the Fourth Era rolls around, by the time Skyrim's main storyline begins, by the time dragons are burning farmsteads and the last dragonborn is stumbling out of a cart, at Helgen the Greybeards number exactly 5. 4 of them are human, living in High Hrothgar. One of them is the dragon Paarthurnax, who lives above the monastery, at the absolute summit, and whom we'll come to at length. But for now, the 4 men in those stone halls, Arngeir is the eldest, and the most powerful of the human Greybeards. He is also, as far as the game's Fourth Era storyline is concerned, the only one of them who can safely hold a full conversation in normal language. Not because the others lack the intelligence or the desire, but because their mastery of the thu'um has become so complete, so saturated into every syllable they produce, that even casual speech generates force. When Bori, Wulfgar, or Einarth speak more than a word or two, the building trembles, the air changes, mortar shifts in the walls. Arngeir has developed enough control that he can modulate his voice, pull it back enough that a normal conversation doesn't destroy his surroundings. This makes him the ambassador, the face, the voice of the Order in interactions with visitors. And he takes that role seriously, perhaps more seriously than anyone who's played Skyrim might initially appreciate, given how guarded and slightly prickly he can seem at first. When you understand what he's protecting and why, the guardedness makes complete sense. He was, according to the lore, studying the way of the voice long before the Fourth Era's crises began. He learned shouts, including unrelenting force, fire breath, frost breath, ice form, and clear skies, among others. He's not simply a wise old monk who happens to know a few words. He is a master of reality-altering vocal power who has spent decades keeping that power on the most precisely controlled leash imaginable. When he speaks quietly, it's a choice. When he raises his voice slightly to demonstrate a shout for the Dragonborn, it's an act of enormous care and deliberate restraint. The other three, Bori, Wulfgar, and Einarth, exist in the game mostly as presences rather than personalities, which is entirely appropriate given their situation. They don't speak words. They greet the Dragonborn with deep, resonant acknowledgments. Dova Keen, when the ceremony of recognition happens and the stone floors of High Hrothgar vibrate with the weight of even that single word. If you're playing the game and you stand near one of them when they murmur that greeting, the screen shakes slightly. The game is telling you something true about the world. These men are not safely approachable the way most NPCs are. Proximity to their speech is proximity to force. When the Greybeards formally acknowledge the Dragonborn after the retrieval of Jurgen Windcaller's horn, they say, all together, Lingra, Croesus, Sauron, Strungdual, Voth Nid Balan, Clov Pran Now. It translates roughly as, long has the storm crown lingered without a claimant, with no worthy storm to match it. The building shakes, the word Dovahkiin rolls out across the mountain, and is heard, quite literally, across all of Skyrim. Ulfric Stormcloak, the man at the center of Skyrim's civil war, who used the thu'um to kill the High King and ignite a rebellion. He was once a student here. He came to High Hrothgar as a young man and trained with the Greybeards for nearly a decade, learning the way of the voice. He learned enough to use unrelenting force and disarm. He left before completing his training, because the great war between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion broke out, and Ulfric felt he could no longer remain in contemplative isolation, while Nords were dying for an empire he increasingly resented. Arngeir still refers to Ulfric's training respectfully, even while clearly disapproving of the path Ulfric eventually took. Ulfric, for his part, still calls Arngeir Master Arngeir. There is something quietly devastating in that. The relationship between teacher and student persists, even when the student has walked a road the teacher would never walk. The Greybeards don't excommunicate or condemn. They simply hold the door open, always, for anyone who wants to come back to the way. This brings up something important about the Greybeards' philosophy of membership. They don't turn people away based on birth or race or background. Almost anyone who shows genuine talent for the voice is welcome to come and study. The filtering mechanism is the philosophy itself. The way of the voice asks for a lifestyle that most people, warriors, politicians, people who want to use power for visible ends in the world, simply can't accept. The discipline required is monumental. The sacrifice of public life is total. The commitment to silence and internal practice is so extreme that it makes most religious orders look casual by comparison. And so, by the Fourth Era, only 5 beings remain. 5, in a world of millions. 5 people, 4 human monks, and 1 ancient dragon who chose the most difficult possible relationship with the most powerful force available to mortals, and chose it for reasons of pure spiritual conviction. They are a small light in an enormous dark, and the strange thing is that because of what they are, their smallness is itself a kind of statement. Section 6. Dovahzul, the language that is the world. At this point, we need to spend real time with Dovahzul, not just to understand the Greybeards better, but because the mechanics of the thu'um, what it actually is, and how it works on a cosmological level, are central to everything the Greybeards believe and practice. Dovahzul, dragon voice, dragon tongue, the language spoken by the dove, the dragons, from before the beginning of recorded history. Bethesda didn't design Dovahzul as a simple naming language with a handful of cool-sounding words. It has its own grammar, its own consistent alphabet, its own phonetics that draw on Old English and Old Norse, and something older that doesn't quite map to either. The runes that appear carved into word walls throughout Skyrim, those 3 slash and hook marks that look like claw marks in stone, because they functionally are, form a complete writing system. The fan community at thu'um.org has spent years expanding the documented vocabulary into something approaching a functional, constructed language. But the grammar and the vocabulary aren't the interesting part. The interesting part is the theology underneath it. In Elder Scrolls cosmology, Dovazul is not a language that describes reality. It is a language that is reality. When a dragon speaks, the speaking and the thing spoken are not separate events. The dragon who says the Dovazul word for fire is not requesting fire, or naming fire, or describing fire. The word Yol is not a symbol that points to the concept of fire. Yol is fire, made manifest through draconic utterance. The utterance and the phenomenon are the same event. This is a profound and deeply strange idea if you sit with it. Most human languages work by pointing. The word tree points at the thing tree. Remove the word, and the tree continues to exist. In Dovazul, the relationship is different. The word and the thing it refers to are the same thing in different modes. To speak is to enact. To name is to summon or alter or destroy. For dragons, this relationship with language is innate. They don't learn to speak in a way that bends reality, they simply speak. And reality responds, because that's what they are. Their souls, their breath, their voices are all the same faculty. The thu'um, the shout, the voice, is just that faculty at full expression. For mortals, the situation is more complicated and far more costly. Humans can't simply speak Dovazul and have the world respond. At least, most can't. The process of learning a word of power is not like learning a foreign word. A mortal must come to fully understand the concept behind the word at an almost metaphysical level. When you learn the word phosphorus, the first word of the unrelenting force shout, you're not just memorizing a sound. You're aligning your inner understanding of what force is, what it means cosmically, with the draconic concept that the word embodies. This is why Greybeard masters take years of meditation to learn a single word. The meditation isn't study in the conventional sense. It's a process of becoming, of transforming your own comprehension until it can hold the shape of the concept the word represents. The Dragonborn is unique because they can absorb this understanding directly from a dragon's soul. When a dragon dies and the Dragonborn absorbs its essence, they're not just gaining magical energy. They're taking in a dragon's fundamental comprehension of the words it knew. This is why the Dragonborn can learn shouts so much faster than any ordinary mortal they're not building, understanding from scratch, but receiving it, whole and fully formed, from a being for whom the words were never separate from reality. This is also why the Greybeard's silence is not just a lifestyle preference, but a genuine safety measure. Think about what a master of the way of the voice has inside them after decades of practice. Not just vocabulary in a human sense, but deep, settled, complete understanding of words whose utterance reshapes reality. They don't carry these things like a collection of tools they can pick up and put down. They are embedded. The words are part of them, woven into how they process and express existence. Every time they open their mouths for casual speech, they're navigating a landscape where any syllable could, in the wrong configuration, carry enough resonance to cause unintended effects. A master tongue saying a cheerful good morning in Dovazul might set off an avalanche. A graybeard laughing too freely in the wrong language might crack stone. The very breath of these men, having been trained and refined and focused through years of practice, is in some sense always loaded. So they don't speak. They don't take the risk. They choose silence, not as privation, but as responsibility. They are carrying something too heavy to wave around, and they know it. The way of the voice articulates this explicitly in the philosophy that Arngir describes to the Dragonborn during training. The voice was a gift of the goddess Kinnereth at the dawn of time. She gave the mortals the ability to speak as dragons do. Although this gift has often been misused, the only true use of the voice is for the worship and glory of the gods. True mastery of the voice can only be achieved when your inner spirit is in harmony with your outward actions. That phrase, inner spirit in harmony with outward actions, is doing enormous philosophical work. It's saying that you can't wield Dovazul effectively or safely or legitimately unless what you are inside matches what you're doing outside. If you're full of anger and pride and ambition, and you try to shout, the shout might still work mechanically, but it won't be true in the way a graybeard's shout is true. You'll be forcing the world into a shape that doesn't align with what's actually real about you in that moment. And the world, which is sensitive to Dovazul in the way that most things aren't, might push back in ways you don't expect. This is partly why Jurgen decided the Nordic tongues had lost at Red Mountain. not because their voices were weak, but because they were using a gift that required genuine spiritual alignment to function properly in a context, military conquest, earthly ambition that was fundamentally misaligned with what the gift was for. The mismatch itself was the problem. The voice was being forced to serve ends it was never designed to serve, and the universe, in its own way, had an opinion about that. Section 7. What the Greybeards could do and choose not to. Here is something that doesn't get discussed enough when people talk about the Greybeards. They are not weak. They are not a collection of old men who sit on a mountain because they lack the power to do anything else. They are not pacifists because they lost some war long ago and gave up. The Greybeards are pacifists because they have seen what they could do if they weren't, and they have concluded that the gap between could and should is infinite. Let's talk about what Arngir, the most restrained and controlled of the human Greybeards, the one who talks to you in full sentences without leveling the building, actually knows how to do. He knows unrelenting force. He knows fire breath and frost breath. He knows ice form, which encases targets in solid ice. He knows clear skies, which disperses storms. He knows whirlwind sprint, which moves a person across space faster than the eye can track. These are not parlor tricks. These are shouts that can change the outcome of battles, that can halt armies, that can drive dragons out of the sky. And Arngir is, by his own acknowledgement, the least powerful of the Greybeards in terms of raw thu'um strength. Bori, Wulfgar, and Einarth have accumulated even more power through their deeper silence and longer practice. Their voices are more dangerous, not less, for having never been expressed carelessly. The discipline of total silence is itself a form of intensification. When you never spend the energy, it builds. And above all of them, above all of the human Greybeards, is Paarthurnax, a dragon, an ancient being who was already a master of Dovazul before humans even knew that language existed. A creature who spent eons in Alduin's service before making a choice that cost him everything. A being whose breath is literally fire, and whose voice can knock men off mountains, and who chooses every single day to meditate instead of act. When the Greybeards spoke to summon the Dragonborn, when they spoke that one name, barely above a whisper by their own standards, every NPC in Skyrim heard it. Guards stopped on patrol, looking up. Jarls in their longhouses turned their heads toward the sound. The mountain shook. That was a restrained sound. That was them being careful. They used perhaps 1/10,000th of what they're capable of, and it rang through the entire province. The Greybeards don't involve themselves in Skyrim's civil war, not because they don't care about Skyrim. Arngir answers a direct question about this clearly. They serve a higher purpose than any political entity. The Empire, the Stormcloaks, the Holds, the Jarls, all of these are mortal configurations, temporary arrangements of power that will shift and change, and eventually be replaced by other arrangements. The way of the voice is concerned with something older and deeper and more permanent than any of them. Taking sides in a civil war would require them to use the thu'um in service of mortal ambition, which is exactly what Jurgen concluded was the problem in the first place. There's also something else at work here, something more strategic. If the Greybeards inserted themselves into mortal conflicts, the conflicts would stop being mortal conflicts very quickly. One Greybeard shouting in earnest at a battlefield would not merely tip the balance, it would end the battle. It would probably end several battles in the vicinity. The force they carry is so disproportionate to anything that soldiers and jarls can field that their presence would be conclusive in ways that have nothing to do with justice or righteousness or any of the things wars are nominally fought for. The Greybeards don't participate because they know the difference between having power and having the right to use it. They know that capacity and authorization are not the same thing, and they've chosen to hold that line, regardless of what it costs them in terms of watching things happen in the world that they might, given the choice, prefer didn't happen. This is genuinely extraordinary. Extraordinary restraint, extraordinary self-awareness, extraordinary commitment to a principle in the face of enormous capacity to simply make things go the way they want. The philosopher monks on the mountain could end the war. They know it. Arngir knows it when he talks about it. He doesn't pretend otherwise. He just explains, patiently, why ending the war by shouting at it is not something they're willing to do. There is a line that Paarthurnax says that captures all of this better than anything else. He asks the Dragonborn, at their first meeting on the summit, whether it is better to be born good or to overcome your evil nature through great effort. He's asking about himself, about his own history of violence and his long effort to live differently. But the question applies equally to the Greybeards as an institution. They are not good because they lack the capacity for harm. They are good, or they attempt to be, because they have chosen goodness in full knowledge of the alternative, and they have maintained that choice through centuries of practice. That's different. That's harder. And it's more honest. Section 8. Dragonborn across the ages. The Greybeards as witnesses. The Greybeards did not become significant only in the Fourth Era. They have been present, in one form or another, through enormous stretches of Tamriel's history, and their role through that history has been consistent. They watch for the Dragonborn. They wait for the Dragonborn, and when one appears, they call. This is one of the less discussed aspects of the Greybeards' function that the lore handles with genuine elegance. They aren't just a monastery of philosophical monks. They are also, in a very real sense, a detection system and a guidance mechanism for one of the most significant recurring phenomena in Tamrielic history, the appearance of a mortal with the blood of a dragon, capable of learning the thu'um instinctively and absorbing the souls of the creatures they kill. The most famous of these moments, before the last Dragonborn's arrival in the Fourth Era, was the summoning of Tiber Septim, the man who would eventually conquer all of Tamriel and be apotheosized as a ninth divine who is worshipped as Talos by the Nords, and banned as a heresy by the Aldmeri Dominion, and sits at the center of the civil war. In Skyrim's storyline came to High Hrothgar as a young man. The Greybeards spoke his name and called him to the mountain. There, according to the lore, they blessed him, recognized his dragonborn nature, and named him Wisemur Dragon of the North and Stormcrown. He descended from the mountain riding what some accounts describe as clouds themselves, having received the Greybeards' blessing and the boots they gifted him for his cleverness and his riddling. This was not simply a nice ceremony. The Greybeards recognizing and naming a dragonborn was a statement about the structure of reality. It said, "This person has been given something by Akatosh. This person carries the blood and the voice of the dragons. This person is not an ordinary mortal ruler with an army and ambition. This person is something cosmologically significant." And the last time before the Fourth Era that the Greybeards spoke a name, it was Tiber Septim's. The history says that they were silent from that moment, from the Second Era's recognition of the man who would become the first Septim Emperor until the Fourth Era's recognition of the last Dragonborn. That silence spans hundreds of years. Entire dynasties rose and fell. The Oblivion Crisis occurred. The Septim line ended. The White Gold Concordat was signed. The Great War was fought. All of this happened, and the Greybeards stayed silent on their mountain because there was no one to call. Think about what that silence meant. Think about what it would be like to be Arngir, who was already a student of the Way in the late Third Era, according to the lore, to know that you're watching for something specific, waiting for a particular type of person to appear, and to simply not see them, for generations, for decades or more. The silence of the Greybeards isn't just their vow of non-speech. It's also the silence of a vigil that might last longer than any individual life. When Alduin returns in the Fourth Era and the last Dragonborn appears, the Greybeard summoning breaks that centuries-long quiet, and the entire province of Skyrim, which had forgotten what it sounded like when the Greybeards actually spoke in unison, learns again in one extraordinary moment. The Dragonborn's arrival at High Hrothgar and subsequent training under the Greybeards follows a structure that mirrors, in compressed form, what any student of the Way goes through. First, demonstration. Prove that you actually have the thu'um, that this isn't theater. Then instruction. Here are words. Here is how to understand them, rather than merely speak them. Then quest. Go retrieve something that connects you to the tradition, that asks you to engage with the history of what you're joining, rather than simply consuming the benefits of it. The Horn of Jurgen Windcaller quest is the one that sits at the heart of this. The Dragonborn is sent to retrieve the horn from Jurgen's tomb at Ustengrav. Except when they arrive, the horn is already gone. Delphine, one of the last surviving members of the Blades, took it as a way to force a meeting with the Dragonborn. But before the Dragonborn knows this, they stand in the empty stone chamber where Jurgen Windcaller's horn should be, and there is something quietly moving about that moment if you let it land. You're standing in the tomb of the man who created everything the Greybeards are. The man who spent 7 years of his life working out why the most powerful warriors of his age had failed, and came up with an answer that changed the course of Nordic culture forever. His burial place is plain and honest and hard to reach, the way he apparently was. And the thing that was supposed to be there, the artifact connecting past to present, is gone. The Dragonborn's first interaction with Jurgen Windcaller's legacy is its absence, which is frankly a very Elder Scrolls kind of narrative poetry. When the horn is eventually recovered and the Dragonborn returns to High Hrothgar, the Greybeards perform the formal recognition ceremony. And then they do something unusual. They direct the Dragonborn further up the mountain, past High Hrothgar, to the summit, to Paarthurnax. Section 9. Paarthurnax, the dragon on the mountain. His name, in Dovazul, means ambition overlord cruelty. Let that settle for a moment. The leader of the pacifist monk order, the being who has spent thousands of years meditating on restraint and the proper use of power, chose to continue carrying a name that means ambition overlord cruelty. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say, he was given that name and he never shed it, even when everything it described became the opposite of who he was trying to be. He wears it the way a scar is worn, not with pride, necessarily, but with honesty. This is what I was. This is what I fought against becoming. I haven't forgotten. Paarthurnax was Alduin's lieutenant. He was, in the Merethic Era, one of the chief architects of the Dragon Lord's dominion over early humans. The texts say that he committed unspeakable atrocities in that service, and while the Elder Scrolls typically doesn't linger on the specific content of those atrocities, the implication is clear enough. He was doing what dragons under Alduin did, enforcing the hierarchy by any means available. He was, in the language of his name, an overlord, cruel, ambitious in the service of a cause that treated mortals as lesser things. Then something changed. Paarthurnax himself, in conversation with the last Dragonborn at the summit of the throat of the world, gives one account of why he betrayed Alduin. He grew convinced that Alduin's claim to godhood was false, that Alduin was twisting his actual cosmic role, which was to devour the world at the end of each kalpa, each grand cycle of existence, into something else, something smaller and more selfish. Instead of serving the structure of the universe, Alduin was exploiting it, using his power to rule rather than to fulfill his function. And Paarthurnax, who had been taught the true nature of things even as he served someone who was distorting them, eventually couldn't continue. The Nordic tradition gives a different account. Kine intervened. She reached down from the sky, the mother of storms and widow of shore, and she chose Paarthurnax to be the instrument of her mercy to mankind. She sent him to the humans. She asked him to teach them the thu'um so they could save themselves. Both accounts might be true. Divine intervention and personal conviction are not mutually exclusive. Kine may have chosen Paarthurnax partly because something in him was already tilting toward doubt. Either way, what he did was radical. He went to the 3 most accomplished human warriors of the Dragon War, Gormlaith, Golden Hilt, Hakon One-Eye, and Felder the Old, and he taught them the thu'um. He gave them the weapon that had been the exclusive possession of dragons since before time was recorded. He handed over the thing that made his own kind invincible, and he did it knowing exactly what it would mean for the balance of the war. After Alduin was eventually banished using Feldir's Elder Scroll, after the Dragon War was over and the surviving dragons were being hunted to near extinction across Skyrim, Paarthurnax retreated. He went to the throat of the world, the very summit, where the great confrontation happened, and he stayed there. He chose to withdraw from the world entirely, not because he was hiding, but because he was working. He understood something important about himself, something that Jurgen Windcaller's philosophy would eventually formalize into language. The draconic nature is not a thing you defeat once and move past. It's not a battle you win and then you're done. Every dragon is, at its core, a being driven toward domination and conquest. The drive is fundamental. It doesn't go away because you decide it should. It sits inside you and pulls at you in quiet moments and whispers that you could just, and you have to say no, every time, forever. Paarthurnax describes this to the Dragonborn in one of Skyrim's most quietly devastating conversations. He says that he must be ever vigilant against his own nature. He must constantly examine his impulses. The meditation isn't abstract spiritual practice for him, it's necessary quarantine. He stays at the summit because down in the world there are things that would trigger the old responses, powers that would have opinions about who should be in charge, mortals who could be dominated. The pull of a past self that was very good at doing things he has spent thousands of years trying not to do. He chose isolation not as surrender, but as the truest form of resistance he knew. He keeps the mountain between himself and temptation, and he meditates, and he teaches the Greybeards who make the climb to see him, and he waits for something worth coming down for. The Blades want him dead. This is the other great Paarthurnax dilemma of Skyrim's storyline, and it is genuinely one of the most morally interesting choices the game asks players to make. Delphine, the last surviving Grandmaster of the Blades, who spent decades in hiding after the Thalmor systematically murdered most of her order, discovers that Paarthurnax exists and demands his death as the price of the Blades' continued cooperation with the Dragonborn. Her reasoning is direct. Paarthurnax served Alduin. He committed atrocities in Alduin's name. He is a dragon, and dragons are by their nature dangerous, and there is no guarantee that he won't revert to old behavior given the right opportunity. Arngir's response, when the Dragonborn brings this up, is controlled fury. He calls the Blades barbarians, and their demand intolerant. He argues that Paarthurnax has done more to earn peace than anyone living that thousands of years of meditation, of choosing restraint over and over, of teaching the way of the voice to generations of students, is itself an accomplishment so significant that to dismiss it is to miss something fundamental about what virtue actually is. Paarthurnax himself, if you ask him directly, says something even more striking. He doesn't deny his past. He doesn't claim he was different then, or that the atrocities didn't happen. He says, "What is better, to be born good, or to overcome your evil nature through great effort?" It's a question, not an answer. He's not telling you what the right choice is. He's asking you to think about what you actually believe about redemption, about whether actions in the past can be outweighed by sustained effort in the opposite direction, about whether someone who was once monstrous and has spent thousands of years working against that monstrousness still deserves the punishment appropriate to the monster they once were. It is one of the most genuinely philosophical questions any video game has ever asked a player. Section 10. The Throat of the World as a Cosmic Location. The monastery at High Hrothgar exists in a place that would be extraordinary, even without anything built on it. But the Throat of the World isn't just a very tall mountain. It is, in terms of Elder Scrolls cosmology, one of the most significant locations in all of Tamriel, and the significance has been building for a long, long time. Start with Kine, the Nordic goddess of the storm, the widow of Shor, the mother of Nords. In the mythological sense, she is said to have breathed life into humanity at the summit of this mountain. The exhale of a goddess at the top of the world, and mortals came into being. This is not described in the lore as a one-time origin event that has since moved on and been forgotten. The throat of the world is still, in Nordic theology, the place where that breath touched the earth. It is still sacred. It is still the axis around which Nordic spiritual life orients itself. When pilgrims climb those steps, they're not going to a place associated with something that used to be divine. They're going to a place that still is. Add to this the Dragon War. The summit of the throat of the world is where the decisive confrontation between the ancient tongues and Alduin took place, where Gormlaith died, where Hakon fought, where Felder read the Elder Scroll and tore time open and shoved a god through the gap. The violence of that moment, the sheer cosmological weight of what those three people did in that place, left a mark, literally. The time wound exists at the summit, a place where time is damaged, where the past and the present overlap in ways they shouldn't. When the Dragonborn eventually climbs to the summit in the main quest and reads an Elder Scroll at the time wound, they watch the entire battle unfold in front of them, not as a vision or a recording or a memory passed down through texts, as a direct experience of the past, still there, still happening in a sideways sense, bleeding through the tear that Feldir's Elder Scroll left in the world. The battle that happened thousands of years ago is still present at the summit of the throat of the world, because the summit of the throat of the world is a place where time doesn't entirely behave itself. And that elder scroll, the one Feldir used, the one that was used to banish Alduin, is still there. It's there when the Dragonborn needs to find it, preserved at a place called the Tower of Mzark, in the underground Dwemer installation known as Blackreach. It waited. For thousands of years, it waited for someone who would need it. That's what Elder Scrolls do. They exist outside of normal cause and effect, and they wait. The snow at the summit, lore tells us, never melts. The temperature and the seasons below have no authority over the summit of the throat of the world. The snow is perpetual, white and clean, and absolutely still in moments when the wind drops. And it carries properties, alchemical, magical properties, that are the source of the white phial, the legendary artifact that can purify and amplify any liquid placed within it. The phial was crafted from the summit's snow at the peak of the mountain, and nothing else can replicate it, because there is only one place in the world where the snow is that's saturated with whatever the summit carries. What is it saturated with? The lore doesn't say definitively, which is one of the things that makes the Elder Scrolls universe so endlessly satisfying to think about. The residual power of the time wound, the lingering sanctity of Kain's breath, thousands of years of Paarthurnax's meditation, his voice, his fire, his ancient draconic nature held in check, all of it radiating outward into the stone and the air, and eventually the snow. Possibly something older than any of those, something left over from the creation of the world itself, when the gods were still close enough to the land that their proximity left permanent marks. The Greybeards didn't choose this mountain arbitrarily. Jurgen Windcaller didn't look at a map and pick the highest point because it offered the most dramatic views. He chose it because it was already the most sacred place in Skyrim. Because the Way of the Voice, as a practice of honoring Kain and aligning the self with the divine gift she gave, makes the most sense in the one place where she is most present. You go to the center of things when you want to be close to what created you. High Hrothgar is not at the top of the mountain. It's partway up. Paarthurnax is at the top. There is a whole geography of spiritual hierarchy built into that physical layout. The monks who are still working on their practice live below the summit. The being who has been at this longer than any of them, who carries the most complicated relationship with both the past and the present, who meditates on the deepest questions anyone in the Order is asking, he is above them, in the thin air where the world ends and the sky begins, alone with his contemplation. Section 11. The Civil War and the Greybeards' Deliberate Distance. When the Civil War erupted in Skyrim, when Ulfric Stormcloak shouted the High King off his feet and claimed it as a traditional duel rather than murder, and when General Tullius arrived with Imperial forces to put the rebellion down, the Greybeards did something that many people in Skyrim found infuriating. They called a peace conference. The Greybeard peace is a relatively brief moment in the game, but it's worth pausing over because it reveals something important about how the Greybeards understand their role. They reached out to both sides of the Civil War and invited them to High Hrothgar for negotiations. Not because they thought they could force a solution, they made clear they would not compel anyone, but because they could offer a table, a neutral space on sacred ground where the presence of the Greybeards themselves was enough to, briefly, reduce the temperature of the conflict. That invitation being extended was itself significant. It was the Greybeards acknowledging that the dragon crisis, Alduin's return, the destruction being wrought on Skyrim's holds, the existential threat to the province was significant enough to justify their minimal engagement with mortal politics, not to pick sides, not to advocate for either the Stormcloaks or the Empire, but to try, very gently, to slow the bleeding long enough that people could think about the larger threat. Arngeir makes the Greybeards' position clear when asked about it. They believe the Civil War is a tragedy, and they wish it weren't happening. They can see clearly that Skyrim is tearing itself apart at the exact moment it can least afford to. But they will not tell people what to do. They will not use the thu'um to enforce a peace. They will not leverage the enormous authority they carry to push the outcome they might prefer. Because to do so would be to violate the very principle that gives them whatever authority they have. There's a tension here that the Greybeards live with openly. Arngeir acknowledges it. He doesn't pretend it's easy to sit on a mountain with the power to shake the world and watch the world bleed. He just maintains that the alternative, becoming actors rather than witnesses, using the voice to impose outcomes rather than to honor the divine, would be a betrayal of everything Jurgen built. The position is philosophically coherent, but emotionally costly. The Greybeards have chosen a kind of moral integrity that guarantees they'll watch things happen they'd prefer didn't happen. That's the price. They pay it. This connects back to the broader question of what the Greybeards represent in the world. They're not the only powerful faction in Skyrim. The Blades are powerful, or were. The College of Winterhold wields considerable magical force. The Companions have legendary warriors. The Thieves Guild and the Dark Brotherhood operate networks that span the province. All of these groups use their power in the world to pursue agendas, to shape events, to survive and thrive. The Greybeards don't, and their choice not to isn't passivity. It's the most active kind of resistance, the resistance of refusing to become what you could become, simply because you could become it. In a province full of people justifying their violence with necessity, the Greybeards sit at the top of a mountain and choose not to be necessary. That's not nothing. That's a kind of witness that the world, arguably, needs as badly as it needs warriors. Section 12. The First Era and Beyond. How the Greybeards survived. After Jurgen Windcaller died and his first followers continued his work at High Hrothgar, the Greybeards faced a world that had very little patience for what they were doing. The Nordic culture of the early First Era was saturated with the thu'um as a martial tool. Jurgen's conversion of the philosophy from weapon to worship was radical, and to many Nords seemed like defeatism. Why would the most powerful weapon your people have ever known be voluntarily surrendered? The answer that it's not a weapon, it's a gift, and using it as a weapon defiles, it was not immediately compelling to a warrior culture that had just spent generations in a brutal dragon war and was still processing what that conflict had cost them. And yet the Greybeards endured. More than endured. They persisted through the entire First Era, through the Second Era, through the Third, and into the Fourth. The institutional memory they maintained across those millennia is itself a kind of miracle. How does an organization that accepts very few members, requires total lifestyle commitment, and practices in deliberate silence manage to transmit its philosophy intact across thousands of years? The answer, in large part, is Paarthurnax. The dragon who has been at the summit since the Dragon War ended has been practicing the Way of the Voice for longer than the Way of the Voice has had a name. He was meditating on the proper relationship between power and restraint before Jurgen was born. He has watched generations of human Greybeards come to the mountain, train, age, and die, and he has been there for all of it, constant as the stone, carrying the philosophy in its purest form through every era. When Jurgen developed the Way of the Voice, he apparently spent time with Paarthurnax. The dragon was already at the summit, already practicing his own version of what Jurgen was articulating. And Paarthurnax, who had been Alduin's lieutenant and had chosen the opposite of everything Alduin represented, recognized in Jurgen's philosophy something he'd already been living. He became the Order's Grandmaster, not because anyone appointed him, but because he was, self-evidently, the being who had been doing this the longest and most deeply. This creates one of the more unusual institutional structures in all of Elder Scrolls lore. A monastic order whose nominal leader is a species fundamentally different from its members, whose mastery vastly exceeds theirs, who will be there when the last human Greybeard is gone, continuing the same practice, in the same silence, on the same mountain. There is something about this that is very lonely, if you think about it. Paarthurnax has watched every student he's ever had eventually leave or die. He has formed relationships with humans whose entire lifespans are brief flickers by draconic reckoning, and he keeps doing it. He keeps being present for the training, for the philosophy, for the questions, because the Way of the Voice needs a living exemplar, because somebody has to hold the position of the being who tried to dominate everything and chose not to, who lives that choice in full knowledge of the alternative, every day, forever. The Fourth Era version of the Greybeards, 5 beings, 4 elderly human monks, and 1 ancient dragon, is almost certainly the most reduced. The Order has been at any point in its history. The size of the organization has fluctuated across the eras. At peak, presumably, there were more than 5, but the requirements are severe enough, and the way demanding enough, that attrition is built in. Not everyone who starts the training finishes it. Not everyone who finishes it stays. Ulfric didn't. And whatever mysterious processes govern when a dragonborn appears to potentially swell, the ranks are not under the Greybeards' control. So by the time the last Dragonborn arrives, the order is small, but it is intact. The philosophy is uncompromised. The practice is unchanged. The silence still means what it always meant. And Paarthurnax still sits at the summit, fire-breathing and ancient and committed, wrestling with his nature, one day at a time. Section 13. Jurgen's Tomb and the Tradition of Remembrance. There's something the Greybeards do that doesn't get much attention, but deserves more. They actively remember. This sounds like a small thing, but in the context of an order that practices deliberate silence, that avoids writing and politics, and the kind of public presence that usually sustains institutional memory, it is actually quite significant. The horn of Jurgen Windcaller wasn't just an artifact sitting in a tomb by accident. It was placed there intentionally, a tangible connection between the founder and the tradition he left behind. When the Greybeards send the Dragonborn to retrieve it, they're asking for an engagement with history, not just the recovery of an object, but a physical, personal encounter with the person who started all of this. Ustengrav, Jurgen's burial place in the Jalmarch marshes, is not a grand monument. It's not the kind of imposing structure that befits someone who founded an institution that has lasted thousands of years and shaped the course of Nordic culture. It's functional, austere, built the way Jurgen apparently lived, without unnecessary ornamentation, focused on the thing itself rather than the impression it might create. His sarcophagus, as noted, bears his name in the Daedric alphabet, and his spirit can be found later in Sovngarde, the Nordic afterlife. When the Dragonborn encounters Jurgen in Sovngarde during the quest to confront Alduin in his final stronghold, Jurgen says, "Fate drives you, but you follow your own path. Choose wisely, lest you wander into evil." That's a remarkable thing to say to someone you've been waiting thousands of years to meet, someone who is, in some ways, your institution's reason for existing. Not "well done" or "you've finally arrived." Just choose wisely. Follow your own path. The warning not to let destiny become a substitute for judgment. The Greybeards' tradition of remembrance extends beyond Jurgen. The tablets on the 7,000 steps are a form of communal memory lessons preserved in stone for pilgrims to find, each one containing a piece of the philosophy that can be absorbed by anyone willing to make the climb. Not secret knowledge locked away from the unworthy. Open teaching, placed on a public path, available to any person with legs and the willingness to use them. This openness is counterintuitive for an organization that otherwise keeps to itself so aggressively. But it reflects something Jurgen apparently understood. The way of the voice isn't the exclusive property of the Greybeards. They're its stewards, not its gatekeepers. The philosophy belongs to anyone who can truly live it. The tablets on the steps are an invitation extended to the entire world, one stone inscription at a time. Section 14. The language of silence, what the Greybeards' daily life actually looks like. We've talked a lot about the philosophy and the cosmology and the history. Let's spend some time with something more immediate. What the daily life of a Greybeard actually looks like, as much as the lore and the game allow us to piece it together. The answer is quiet, obviously. But what kind of quiet? Not the quiet of people who have given up on language. Not the quiet of people who have decided that communication isn't worth the effort. It's the quiet of people who have developed an entirely different relationship with expression, who have moved beyond ordinary language because they live in the presence of something that makes ordinary language feel inadequate. The Greybeards communicate through gestures and physical cues. They bow in greeting. They acknowledge each other and visitors through small movements that carry the kind of precision that people develop when they can't rely on words. There's something monastic about this in the truest historical sense. The rule of silence in various real-world contemplative traditions was not about not communicating, but about purifying communication, about removing the noise from the signal. In a Greybeard's daily life, meditation is the central activity. Long hours in the cold stone halls of High Hrothgar, sitting with the words they carry, deepening their understanding of the concepts those words represent. Not practicing shouts in the way a warrior practices swords, not running through drills or testing techniques against targets, but sitting with the ideas. What is force? Not the physical phenomenon of kinetic energy applied to an object, but the cosmic concept that the Dovazul word fus represents. What is balance? What is clarity? What is the relationship between the inner state of the person speaking and the effect of the word in the world? These are the questions a greybeard spends a lifetime with, not answering them, necessarily, or at least not arriving at finished answers that can be written down and filed away, but living inside the questions, the way you live inside a house, making the space of the question habitable. There is also the practice of listening. The throat of the world is a noisy place, paradoxically. The wind is constant, and at altitude, it carries a quality that lower ground doesn't, a kind of sustained resonance, as though the air itself is vibrating at a frequency just below audible. The Greybeards call this the voice of the sky. It is, in their theology, Kind's ongoing presence, the continued breath of the goddess who breathed humanity into being at the summit of this mountain. To meditate at High Hrothgar is to meditate in the presence of that sound, to learn to hear it, to tune your awareness to it, to eventually achieve what Arngir calls attunement, the ability to hear the voice of the sky clearly and be changed by what it tells you. What does the voice of the sky actually tell them? The lore is deliberately vague here, which is appropriate. Spiritual experiences that can be fully translated into prose aren't really spiritual experiences in any meaningful sense. The Greybeards' practice is precisely the kind of thing that resists description. It can be pointed at. It can be given context and framing and history. But the experience itself, what it feels like to sit for decades in the thin air of the throat of the world and listen for the voice of a goddess in the wind, that isn't something that survives the translation into words, which is again remarkably appropriate for an order that has concluded that words, used carelessly, are dangerous. Section 15. Legacy. What the Greybeards mean. After everything, after the Dragon War and the Way of the Voice, and Jurgen Windcaller's 7 years of silence, and Paarthurnax's thousands of years of meditation, and the 5 monks who sit in a cold stone hall at the top of the world, what do the Greybeards actually mean? Not just in Skyrim's story, but as a piece of creative work, as a thing the developers put into the world that has resonated with players for over a decade? I think they mean several things simultaneously, and the fact that they can hold all of these meanings without contradiction is part of what makes them one of the most elegantly constructed factions in any game. They mean that power is not self-justifying. The Greybeards carry more raw force than anyone else in Skyrim, and they've decided that force doesn't give them the right to use it. The capacity to dominate is not the same as the authorization to dominate. This is a message that cuts against essentially every other powerful faction in the game. The companions use their power. The college uses its power. The guilds and the Jarl and the Imperial Legion and the Stormcloaks, everyone in Skyrim is using their power for something. The Greybeards are the only faction that has looked at its power and said, we're going to set this down. We're going to live as though we don't have it. They mean that some questions are worth your whole life. The practice of the Way of the Voice isn't a quest you complete and then move on from. It's not something you master and then hold as a credential. It's a lifelong engagement with questions about the nature of language and reality and divinity, and what it means to be a mortal being with access to something divine. Every Greybeard who has ever lived at High Hrothgar gave their entire existence to this inquiry. Jurgen gave 7 years of silent contemplation just to arrive at the beginning of the answer. Paarthurnax has given thousands. The Greybeards model what it looks like to take a question seriously enough to build your whole life around it. They mean that the past is always present. The Greybeards don't forget what happened at the throat of the world in the Merethic Era. They don't pretend the Dragon War is ancient history irrelevant to the present. They maintain that history in their practice, in the tablets on the steps, in the horn in Jurgen's tomb, in Paarthurnax sitting at the summit where the great confrontation happened, still there, still bearing witness. History, for the Greybeards, isn't a completed thing. It's the ground you stand on. And they mean that redemption is real, but costly and ongoing. Paarthurnax is the central proof of this. He was Alduin's lieutenant. He has been fighting his own nature for longer than the oldest human institution in Skyrim has existed. He hasn't won that fight in any final sense. He's just kept choosing the right thing, over and over, for thousands of years. The Way of the Voice argues that this sustained effort is worth something, that the person who was born to cruelty and chose otherwise is not simply the sum of their cruelest moments. that what you overcome matters at least as much as what you once were. These are not small ideas. These are not the kinds of ideas that usually make it into video games, at least not with this kind of nuance and consistency. The Greybeards are a small order, 5 beings in a cold monastery on a very tall mountain, and they contain more philosophical depth than most sprawling fictional institutions 10 times their size. There is one more thing they mean, and it's the quietest of all the things they mean, the one that's easiest to miss. They mean that some things are worth protecting even when, especially when, the world around you is in chaos. The civil war rages, the dragons have returned, the political structures of Skyrim are shaking, the Thalmor maneuver, the Empire weakens. Everything is in motion, everything is uncertain, everything could fall apart in any number of ways, and up on their mountain, in their silence, the Greybeards keep doing the thing they have always done, not because nothing has changed, not because the chaos below them doesn't matter, but because the practice itself, the meditation, the discipline, the careful stewardship of a gift that could destroy the world if handled carelessly, is more important than any particular outcome in the mortal world below. They are, in their own way, a kind of anchor, not an anchor that prevents movement, an anchor that keeps something essential from being swept away when the current is strongest. The sky over Skyrim is heavy and gray and enormous. The clouds roll in from the sea of ghosts. The wind fills the valleys like a voice filling a hall. And somewhere above all of that, 4 old men in gray robes sit in deliberate silence, breathing the thin, cold air at the edge of the world. And one ancient dragon sits above them at the summit, and together they hold the line between what power can do and what power should do. And the mountain is quiet. The mountain is very quiet. And if you listen carefully, underneath the wind, you might almost hear something that doesn't quite have a name yet, something that sounds less like a word and more like the spaces between words, the breath before speaking, the moment of decision before the voice comes out. The Greybeards have been listening to that sound for thousands of years. Maybe that's the whole point. If this helped you find some quiet tonight, or if you learned something that made the world of Skyrim feel a little more alive and real hitting, like genuinely helps more than you might think. It tells the algorithm there's a human being on the other side of this screen, and subscribing means next time there's a fire, a mountain, and a story worth telling slowly, you'll be there. Sleep well, cozy nights. The throat of the world will still be standing when you wake up. End of script. Research sources consulted: UESP, Wiki Lore, Greybeards, Lore, Jurgen Windcaller, Lore, Paarthurnax, Lore, Way of the Voice, Lore, Dragon Language, Skyrim, High Hrothgar, Skyrim, Greybeards, Skyrim, Arngeir, Lore, Alduin, Throat of the World, Time Wound, Lore, Kine, Lore, Dragonborn, Lore, Tiber Septim, Elder Scrolls, Fandom Wiki, The Greybeards, Paarthurnax, Jurgen Windcaller, Ulfric Stormcloak, Torrig, Feldir the Old, Hakon One-Eye, Alduin's Bane, Kynareth. Section 16. The Battle of Red Mountain in detail. The event that made everything. Let's return to the Battle of Red Mountain, because it deserves more than a paragraph. It deserves the full weight of what it actually was. In the early centuries of the First Era, Skyrim was an ambitious place. The Nords had recently emerged from the Dragon War as victors, scarred, depleted, but victors. They had done the unthinkable. They had stood in the same fire as the dragons and come out on the other side. That experience created a culture of enormous confidence, maybe even arrogance. The tongues, the masters of the thu'um, were celebrated figures. Military leaders who could shape battles with their voices were among the most respected people in Nordic society. The voice was their edge, and they knew it, and they used it accordingly. The first empire of the Nords, under the rule of High King Wulfharth and his successors, was genuinely expansionist. They pushed south and east, into Morrowind, into territories held by the Chimer, the people who would eventually become the Dunmer, the Dark Elves. The Chimer, led by the great tribunal figures Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil alongside the Dwemer, were not going to simply accept Nordic expansion without a fight. And so a conflict built that would culminate at Red Mountain, the immense volcanic peak at the center of what is now Morrowind, the sacred mountain of the Chimer, the place where the heart of Lorkhan itself was said to be kept. The Nordic army that marched to Red Mountain was not simply large. It was well armed with the most powerful weapon their culture possessed. Tongues went to war alongside conventional soldiers, and the combination was formidable. Everything about Nordic martial tradition said this should work. The precedent of the Dragon War said this should work. The individual power of the strongest tongues said this should work. It did not work. The specifics of why are murky in the historical record, partially because of the Dragon Break, a fracturing of time itself that accompanied the Battle of Red Mountain, meaning that different accounts of what happened there are simultaneously, impossibly, contradictory, yet true. But the outcome in Skyrim is clear. The Nordic army was destroyed. Not simply defeated, annihilated. The tongues, who had been the pride of Nordic martial culture, were broken. The survivors who came home brought nothing but the news of the catastrophe and the weight of trying to explain the inexplicable. For Jurgen Windcaller, personally surviving this, the text suggests he was present and survived. Though again, the Dragon Break makes specifics uncertain, the experience was fundamentally destabilizing in the best possible way. Not physically destabilizing, he was alive, and apparently intact, but the entire framework through which he understood himself and his power was no longer functional. The certainty that the thu'um was the ultimate military asset had been disproven. The belief that mastery of the voice meant practical invincibility had been shattered. And if those beliefs were wrong, then something else had to account for the defeat. Some other explanation had to exist. Jurgen chose to find it by going silent. 7 years is a long time to be quiet. 7 years of not using the voice as a weapon, not engaging in the political debates of his era, not lending his considerable power to any of the factions or conflicts of the early First Era. 7 years of sitting with one question and not accepting easy answers. What he came out with the way of the voice was not a comfort to the political establishment of Skyrim at the time. If anything, it was an indictment. It said that the culture that had celebrated the thu'um as its greatest tool had fundamentally misunderstood the tool. It said that the defeat at Red Mountain wasn't bad luck or superior enemy tactics. It was a consequence of misalignment, of using something sacred, as though it were merely practical. This was easier to dismiss as philosophical nonsense than to engage with seriously, and many people did exactly that. The argument we lost because we weren't pure enough in our use of the voice doesn't map cleanly onto military thinking. You can't train for purity. You can't build purity into a strategy. Generals and jarls don't have a lot of patience for explanations that can't be operationalized. But Jurgen wasn't speaking to generals. He was speaking to anyone who could hear what he was actually saying, that the relationship between a person and the divine gift they've been given is a moral and spiritual question, not a tactical one. And in time, enough people heard him that the tradition took root and grew, and eventually, quietly and without any military campaign whatsoever, became one of the most enduring institutions in all of Tamriel. That's remarkable, if you think about it. A philosophy born from a military defeat, developed during 7 years of silence, preached by a man who refused to demonstrate its power through conventional power displays, somehow outlasted every empire and every institution that dismissed it. The Greybeards are here in the Fourth Era. The first empire of the Nords is not. Section 17. The voice in Nordic culture, before and after the way. To fully understand what the Greybeards represent, it helps to understand the full arc of the thu'um's role in Nordic culture, not just the moment the Greybeards were founded, but the long history on both sides of that founding. Before the way of the voice, the thu'um was used in ways that would make any Fourth Era Greybeard profoundly uncomfortable. Construction. That's one of the more remarkable ones. The ancient Nords used shouts to place stone to move enormous blocks of rock that no purely physical effort could shift, to seal structures, to hollow out spaces in bedrock. The Nordic burial mounds that dot Skyrim's landscape, with their enormous stone doors and their perfectly fitted megalithic construction, exist in part because the people who built them could shout stone into position. The word walls, those carved monoliths embedded into the sides of cliffs and the backs of ancient tombs, were placed where they are because someone could make the stone cooperate through voice. Agriculture. The growing season in Skyrim is brutally short. The climate is cold, the soil in many places poor. the frost arriving earlier and staying later than in more southerly provinces. But in the First Era, Nordic communities could push that growing season wider, with the voice encouraging crops, clearing frost, coaxing growth from reluctant ground. The thu'um was not separate from daily life. It was woven into it the way water is woven into farming. Communication. The voice, properly wielded, can carry across distances that would defeat any shout or signal fire. In the early Nordic world, tongues served as long-distance communicators, as relayers of orders across battlefields, as the living equivalent of signal towers. A master tongue shouting a message in Dovazul from one hilltop could be heard and understood by another master tongue standing miles away. The specifics of how this worked aren't fully spelled out in the lore, but the application is mentioned enough times to suggest it was common practice. Healing. The thu'um in peaceful applications could apparently be turned toward the body, not in the way that magical schools of restoration work, with light and auras and specifically medicinal spells, but in some more fundamental way, using the words of power to address injuries or illness at a level below conventional treatment. The specifics are vague in the sources, which is often the case when the lore touches on practices that have been lost rather than merely discontinued. And warfare, of course. All of this, the full spectrum of human need and aspiration expressed through the divine gift of Dovazul. The thu'um as tool, as art, as communication, as medicine, as weapon. A culture that had fully integrated its relationship with the voice rather than siloing it. After Jurgen, after the way of the voice took hold, this integration didn't vanish overnight, but it began to narrow. The emphasis on the thu'um as sacred rather than practical meant that the casual, everyday applications fell out of use first. Why use a shout to move a stone when you can build scaffolding? Why use the voice to encourage crops when you can simply plant more? The everyday applications, stripped of their sacred context by the new philosophy, seemed like overkill, like using an artifact of cosmic significance to open a jar. And without the everyday applications keeping the cultural relationship with the voice alive and practical, the knowledge slowly contracted. By the Fourth Era, in Skyrim's present, virtually nobody uses the thu'um outside of the Greybeards, and the very occasional tongue like Ulfric Stormcloak, who trained formally. The voice has gone from a pervasive feature of Nordic culture to something almost mythological talked about, referenced in songs and stories, but not actually encountered in daily life. The Greybeards, ironically, are partly responsible for this contraction. By insisting that the voice was too sacred for casual use, they inadvertently contributed to the loss of the casual applications that would have kept the knowledge circulating. The result is a world where the most powerful force available to mortals has become almost inaccessible, held only by 5 individuals on a mountain, which is safe in the sense that the risk of misuse is minimal, and impoverished in the sense that something that used to enrich everyday life has been nearly eliminated from everyday life. This is not a criticism of the Greybeards. Jurgen's conclusion about misuse was probably correct. The defeat at Red Mountain was real, and whatever caused it, and the lore genuinely does leave room for multiple interpretations. The response of treating the voice with profound seriousness, rather than casual instrumentalism, was probably the right response. But the effect is worth noting. Sacred things, elevated above daily life, tend to become inaccessible things. The elevation that preserves them also isolates them. Section 18. The Greybeards and the Blades. An essential conflict. The Greybeards and the Blades have disagreed about almost everything for a very long time. The Blades are, by origin, an Akaviri organization. Their roots trace back to the continent of Akavir, across the ocean, to the east of Tamriel, where they arrived as invaders in the distant past and eventually became defenders. By the Fourth Era, they have been, for most of their history, the personal bodyguard and intelligence service of the dragonborn emperors of the Septim dynasty. They protected the dragonborn rulers. They hunted dragons. They preserved knowledge about dragons and the dragonborn lineage that nobody else maintained, and they strongly, philosophically, viscerally disagree with the Greybeards' approach to the thu'um and to dragons generally. The Blades see the voice as a weapon that should be mastered and deployed for the protection and advancement of the dragonborn, whoever that is at any given moment. They see dragons as threats to be neutralized. They see Paarthurnax as a dragon, therefore a threat, who committed documented atrocities and has been permitted to exist only because of the Dragonborn Emperor's protection. With the Septim line ended, that protection is no longer operative. The Blades want him dead. Delphine, who is by the Fourth Era essentially the last functioning agent of the Blades in Skyrim, makes this case to the last Dragonborn with characteristic directness. Paarthurnax is dangerous. His past is unambiguous. The fact that he's been behaving himself for thousands of years doesn't erase the fact that his name means ambition overlord, cruelty, and that he earned that name honestly. He is a dragon. Dragons are the Blades' sworn enemy. The Dragonborn should kill him. Arngir's response, when the Dragonborn brings this up, is as close to angry as the Greybeards apparently get. He calls the Blades intolerant. He says their demand is a betrayal of everything Paarthurnax has done. He frames the Blades' position as the barbarism of people who have confused an old grudge with justice. And then he goes quiet, because he has no control over what the Dragonborn chooses. The conflict between these two factions is, when you examine it closely, a conflict between two genuinely coherent moral frameworks that simply cannot be reconciled. The Blades argue from the logic of threat and precedent. A dragon who served Alduin and committed atrocities is a dragon who might serve Alduin again or commit atrocities again under the right circumstances. You cannot trust a being whose fundamental nature inclines toward domination simply because they've chosen not to act on that nature recently. The history matters. The past matters. You cannot simply declare someone reformed and take it on faith. The Greybeards argue from the logic of sustained action and moral seriousness. What Paarthurnax has done since his betrayal of Alduin, thousands of years of meditation, of teaching, of choosing restraint over power, of sitting at the summit of the throat of the world and doing the hard daily work of being better than his nature, this is not nothing. This is, in fact, everything. If we judge beings only by their worst moments and give no weight to sustained effort in the opposite direction, we've created a moral framework that makes redemption impossible by definition. The Dragonborn gets to decide, and the game gives full weight to both choices. Siding with the Blades and killing Paarthurnax closes off the Greybeards' assistance permanently. Arngir will no longer reveal word wall locations, will barely speak to the Dragonborn. Siding with the Greybeards and sparing Paarthurnax means the Blades will never accept the Dragonborn as their leader, will barely speak to them. Neither faction forgives the Dragonborn for choosing the other. Neither faction pretends that both positions are equally right. The game treats this as the genuine moral dilemma it is, without providing a correct answer, which is braver, honestly, than most games would be. Section 19. The night the Greybeards last spoke. Tiber Septim. The last time the Greybeards spoke before calling the last Dragonborn, the last time before the centuries of silence that ended when dragons returned to Skyrim, they spoke to name a young warrior from High Rock, whose name at that time was Hjalti Earlybeard. History knows him better as Tiber Septim, Talos, the Ninth Divine, the man who united all of Tamriel under a single empire for the first and only time. The man whose worship was banned by the White Gold Concordat 300 years after his death, making his name itself a political flashpoint in the very land he was born in. The man whose name the Greybeards recognized before he was any of those things, when he was just a young soldier with an unusual gift. The story of how Tiber Septim came to the Greybeards is appropriately mythological. In the Second Era, during the long chaos of the interregnum between the Second Empire and the Third, a figure known at that time as General Talos was rising through the ranks of a Colovian warlord's army. He had already demonstrated the thu'um in battle had used the voice to break enemy formations and inspire his own troops. When the Greybeards sensed this, they called him. He climbed the 7,000 steps. He met the monks and the dragon. What passed between them in those halls is not fully recorded, partly because whatever the Greybeards said was said mostly in silence in the ways they have of communicating that don't involve words, and partly because what Tiber Septim took away from the experience is described by him in ways that are more poetic than precise. He descended from the mountain, having been named Wismer Dragon of the North and Stormcrown, names that acknowledged his dragonborn nature and pointed toward the destiny the Greybeards apparently glimpsed in him. He also descended, some accounts suggest, wearing boots gifted to him by the Greybeards for his cleverness in riddling with them, an appropriately mythological detail that appears in enough different sources to be worth mentioning, even if the specifics are obscure. What's significant about this moment is what the Greybeards were doing by naming Tiber Septim. They weren't endorsing his political ambitions. They weren't signing on to the project of building an empire. They weren't, as some have suggested, predicting or decreeing that he would conquer Tamriel. What they were doing was recognizing a cosmological fact. This person has the blood of a dragon. This person carries Akatosh's blessing in their soul. This person is significant in ways that transcend the political arrangements of any particular era. The political arrangements, as it turned out, were also pretty significant. Tiber Septim did conquer Tamriel. He did build the Third Empire. He did eventually ascend to divinity as Talos. And it's worth noting that throughout the process of doing all of those extraordinary things, he apparently retained some connection to the Greybeards. The texts describe him as still haunted by the prophecy given him by the Greybeards, even late in his career, when he was already one of the most powerful men in the world. What was the prophecy? That isn't recorded clearly enough to state definitively, but the implication is that Tiber Septim, the greatest conqueror in Tamriel's history, the man who made the world bow to his ambition, carried inside him the knowledge that the Greybeards had given him, that the voice was sacred, that his destiny was bigger than any military campaign, that the thing he was building would matter in ways he might not live to see. After his naming, the Greybeards went silent. That silence lasted from sometime in the Second Era into the Fourth, possibly 500 years or more, depending on how you calculate the timelines. 500 years of watching the world from their mountain, of watching the Third Empire rise and fall, of watching the Oblivion Crisis nearly unmake everything, of watching the White Gold Concordat signed and Talos worship banned in the very land where Talos grew up, of saying nothing because there was no one to call, until there was. Section 20. The Last Dragonborn and what the Greybeards offered. When the last Dragonborn arrived at High Hrothgar, after the summoning that shook Skyrim, after the climb through frost trolls and ice wraiths, and the meditative passage through 10 stone tablets on a snowy mountain path, what they found was not what most visitors to powerful institutions find. There was no ceremony of welcome, no celebration, no feast or warm fire or assembled dignitaries. Just 4 old men in gray robes, standing in a cold stone hall, and the deep, resonant weight of their silence filling the space the way water fills a vessel. Arngir, who speaks, began the test. He asked for proof, not from arrogance or skepticism, but from the discipline of a practice that has no patience for performance. Either you have the thu'um or you don't. Either you can demonstrate it or you can't. He asked the Dragonborn to shout, and when they did, when the unrelenting force erupted from them, with the instinctive ease that only a true Dragonborn can manage, the other Greybeards stirred. You can almost see them in that moment, these men for whom everything external is noise and only the quality of the voice matters, registering something real. And then they taught. The teaching the Greybeards offer the Dragonborn is not simply vocabulary. They give words, yes, whirlwind sprint, the words of unrelenting force the Dragonborn didn't already know. Clear skies. But more significantly, when they give a word, they give understanding with it. Einarth, one of the monks who doesn't speak in conversation, writes the word ro, meaning balance, in the floor of High Hrothgar with his breath, and the Dragonborn absorbs its meaning without the usual requirement of having heard it in combat or studied it on a word wall. The Greybeards' understanding of the word is so complete and so settled that it transmits through proximity and intention. This is the Greybeards at their most generous. They have spent their lives cultivating depth of understanding rather than breadth of application. And when the moment comes to pass that understanding on to someone who needs it urgently, they can do it not through instruction in the conventional sense, but through the kind of presence that only comes from having lived inside a question long enough that the answer is part of your breathing. Arngir's guidance across the main quest is measured and honest. He acknowledges what the Greybeards don't know. He doesn't pretend they have all the answers about Alduin or how to stop him. He sends the Dragonborn to Paarthurnax when the question exceeds what he can address. He's clear about the limits of his own perspective, including his own bias against the Blades and his own commitment to a philosophy that not everyone shares or should share. What the Greybeards ultimately offer the last Dragonborn is not power. The Dragonborn has power already, intrinsically, by virtue of what they are. What they offer is context, a tradition to step into, a framework for understanding what the voice is and what it's for, that is older and more seriously considered than anything else available. They offer the long view, the 1,000-year view, the view from the top of a mountain where empires look small and the wind sounds like a goddess and the whole chaotic, painful, beautiful mess of Nirn below resolves into something like perspective. Whether the Dragonborn takes that offer seriously is, of course, up to the player. The game doesn't require engagement with the philosophy. You can run through the Greybeard questline in an afternoon, absorb the shouts, and move on to the next quest marker. The way of the voice will wait. It always has. Section 21, The Frozen Summit. Paarthurnax's final question. There is a moment, when you first reach the summit of the Throat of the World in Skyrim, that the game does something rare. It slows down. There's no combat, no immediate threat, no ticking clock. You climb the last few meters of steep slope, and the view opens up in every direction, the whole of Skyrim spread out below you, impossibly vast, impossibly beautiful, and then there is the word wall, cracked and ancient, and there is a great dragon sitting on it. Not a hostile dragon, not a dragon that attacks on sight, a dragon that flies in from somewhere above, circles once, and lands in front of you, and speaks. Drem Yol Lok, greetings, Wundunic. I am Paarthurnax. The voice is enormous and careful and old in a way that has texture to it, like very worn stone. He asks who you are. He answers your questions. He teaches you a word, Fus, the first word of unrelenting force, by breathing fire at the word wall and letting you read the uncovered rune. He demonstrates, in that simple act, everything the Greybeards have been trying to tell you. The word and the reality it names are the same thing. And a being who is the reality can reveal the word simply by being what they are. And then he talks about himself. Paarthurnax doesn't talk about his past with shame, exactly. He talks about it with the clarity of someone who has had thousands of years to examine it and isn't interested in either minimizing or dramatizing it. Yes, he served Alduin. Yes, he did terrible things. Yes, his name is an accurate description of what he was. He holds all of this with the same quality of attention the Greybeards apply to their words, completely present with it, not flinching away from it, not dressing it up in the language of redemption narratives that make the speaker seem more sympathetic than the facts warrant. And then he asks the question that has been rattling around in philosophical thought for a very long time, given a form in this context that somehow makes it feel fresh. What is better, to be born good, or to overcome your evil nature through great effort? He's asking about himself. He's also asking about everyone, about what moral credit, if any, is due to a being who was made in a particular way and has spent a very long time working against that nature, about whether the effort itself has value, independent of whether it ever fully succeeds, about what good actually means when good is not the default. The Dragonborn doesn't answer. The question is left hanging in the thin, cold air at the top of the world, which is the right place to leave it. Some questions are not improved by being answered. What Paarthurnax does instead, after the question, is get back to the work. He helps the Dragonborn understand how to use the time wound. He helps develop the plan for confronting Alduin. When Alduin returns to the summit and the battle happens, Paarthurnax is there, fighting the creature who was once his older brother, whom he once served, whom he betrayed, and whose return he has been dreading for thousands of years. He fights on the side of the mortals. Again. Still. After the dragon crisis ends and Alduin is defeated, Paarthurnax says something that is easy to miss in the resolution of the storyline. He speaks of going out into the world, of finding the dragons now scattered across Tamriel, the ones who followed Alduin, the ones who are now leaderless and confused and dangerous, and trying to teach them what he has learned, trying to teach them the way of the voice, trying to do for other dragons what Kine and his own bitter experience did for him. Whether this works is not recorded in any 4th Era text available. It's one of the open threads the Elder Scrolls universe deliberately leaves hanging because the world is too large and too complicated to close every loop. But the intention itself says something. Paarthurnax, having spent thousands of years at the summit, is choosing to come down, to use what he's learned in the world rather than keeping it for himself on the mountain. The circle of Jurgen Windcaller's philosophy, begun by one human warrior who retreated from the world to understand the gift he'd been misusing, and continued for thousands of years by a dragon who retreated from the world for similar reasons. That circle is expanding. Slowly, painfully, with no guarantee of success, but expanding. That, maybe, is the most hopeful thing the Greybeards represent. Not the certainty that things will go well, not the promise that enough meditation will solve the world's problems, but the persistent, evidence-based possibility that a being can choose differently than their nature demands, and that the choice, made again and again across a very long time, means something real. The mountain is still standing. The wind is still moving through the valleys like a voice in a hall. Somewhere above the clouds, in the thin air where the sky begins and the world recedes to a beautiful, manageable distance, 5 beings sit in deliberate silence. And the questions they're sitting with are the ones that don't have finished answers, the questions worth spending your whole existence on. Sleep well. Section 22. What the silence actually sounds like, the Greybeards, as a sensory experience. There's something worth sitting with that is easy to intellectualize away. The Greybeards are an experience before they're a philosophy. When you arrive at High Hrothgar in the game, before Arngir explains anything about the way of the voice or the history of Jurgen Windcaller, you feel the place. The sound design of High Hrothgar is doing something deliberate. The monastery is not quiet in the way that a library is quiet, where the silence is the absence of sound. It has its own texture. The wind works at the stone walls from outside, a low, continuous pressure that you can feel more than hear. Inside, every footfall on the stone floor has a resonance that sounds different from other interiors, heavier, somehow, as though the stone itself has absorbed so many years of careful human movement that it responds with consideration. When the Greybeards are nearby, there is a subsonic quality to the air around them, a barely there vibration that the game achieves through very low-frequency ambient sounds. And when one of them speaks even a few syllables, the building answers. Not catastrophically, they're not losing control, but the stone knows what lives in these walls. The stone has been listening to these men for however many years. Each of them has been here, and it has oriented itself accordingly. The floor is a resonance chamber. The walls are sounding boards. The whole monastery is, in a physical, architectural sense, tuned to the voice in the way a concert hall is tuned to music. This is not accidental. The lore suggests that High Hrothgar was constructed with the thu'um in mind, that Jurgen and whoever helped him build it understood that the monastery would need to accommodate the physical reality of its inhabitants. The stone is thick enough to absorb the inadvertent resonances that come off a master tongue simply breathing. The rooms are arranged so that the Greybeards can move through their daily routines without being too close to each other, because the combined field of their unconscious resonance, if they stood together without purpose, would probably not be comfortable for the uninitiated. When the Dragonborn arrives and the Greybeards choose to speak together, to shout informal acknowledgement during the ceremony, the game makes this felt. The screen vibrates. The sound fills the available space completely, the way water fills a container, and then keeps going, through the walls and into the mountain and out the other side. You can imagine, standing there, what it would be like if they chose to shout in earnest, if they chose to stop holding back. The difference between what you're experiencing and what they're capable of is like the difference between a candle and the sun. The sensory reality of the Greybeards is part of what makes them compelling, in a way that purely philosophical characters often aren't. You don't just understand their power intellectually. You feel it in the bass frequencies under the ambient sound, in the way the stone seems aware, in the quality of silence they generate that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of discipline applied to sound. Every interaction with them is an interaction with controlled force. Every quiet moment in that monastery is a moment where something enormous is being very carefully held in check. The feeling is something like standing next to a large, ancient tree on a day when there is lightning in the sky, not danger, exactly, but a heightened awareness that you're in the presence of something that doesn't operate by the same rules you do, and that is treating you with a gentleness that is genuinely its own kind of power. This is what the way of the voice looks like from the outside. Not the philosophy, or the history, or the cosmic significance, but the simple, immediate sensory experience of being near people who have spent their lives learning that power and gentleness are not opposites, that the most precise control of the most destructive force available produces not hardness, but a kind of stillness that you can feel in your chest. The Greybeards don't need you to understand the theory. The theory is secondary to the experience. Jurgen didn't develop his philosophy and then go looking for a mountain to match it. He went to the mountain because the mountain was right, because the thin air and the silence and the weight of the place called to something he was developing inside himself. The monastery at High Hrothgar is an externalization of an internal state. The walls and the resonant stone and the careful arrangement of space, all of it is what a Greybeard's relationship with the voice looks like when you build it in stone. Section 23. Kyne's Mountain. The theology underlying everything. We've talked about Kyne several times throughout this script, but she deserves her own dedicated section because she is not peripheral to the Greybeards' practice. She is the center of it. In the Nordic religious tradition, the pantheon looks different from the imperial version that is spread throughout Tamriel. The Imperials worship the 8 divines, later the 9, with the inclusion of Talos, a formalized, organized, politically managed religion with chapels and priests, and a theology that has been worked over by generations of scholars to be internally consistent and broadly applicable across diverse cultures. It is, in other words, a religion that has been civilized, domesticated to a degree, made safe for large-scale institutional use. The Nordic version is older and wilder and considerably less interested in being civilized. Kyne, in the Nordic pantheon, is the goddess of the storm, not weather in general, specifically storms, the violent, transformative, boundary-dissolving kind of atmospheric event that takes everything that has been settled and organized and lifts it up and moves it around. She is the widow of Shor, the Nords' version of Lorcan, the missing god who sacrificed himself to create the mortal world, who gave his heart to make existence possible and was killed for it. And in Shor's absence, following his death, Kyne acts as the leader of the Nordic pantheon. She is not simply a nature goddess. She is a widow carrying the weight of a cosmic sacrifice, and she has continued to show up for her people despite or because of that grief. The rain that falls on Skyrim is Kyne's tears in Nordic myth. Not a fanciful metaphor, a literal cosmological claim. Every time it rains on the province, Kyne is mourning Shor. The land is watered by divine grief. The crops grow in sacred sorrow. This is a theology that does not separate the natural world from the emotional and spiritual world. For the Nords, the weather is not mechanical, it is personal. And the thu'um, the voice, the shout is Kyne's gift to her children. She taught the Nords to speak as dragons do, according to the legend, so that they could survive the dragon war. Some versions of the story say she did this through her daughters. Some say she did it through Paarthurnax, whom she sent to teach the first tongues directly. Some say she did both simultaneously, which, given that this is a Bronze Age goddess, operating in a universe where linear causation is more of a suggestion than a law, is entirely possible. What all versions agree on is that the thu'um is not a human invention. It's not something the Nords developed on their own. It was given. The divine origin is not a symbolic claim about the power feeling transcendent. It's a literal claim that a goddess reached down into the mortal world and handed her children a tool. And if that's true, if the thu'um genuinely originates with Kyne, then Jurgen Windcaller's conclusion after Red Mountain makes perfect sense. You don't use a goddess's personal gift to conquer territory in her name and expect the gift to respond cheerfully. The relationship between the giver and the given to matters. The context in which the gift is used matters. A mother who teaches her children to speak doesn't expect them to use that speech to bully their siblings. The Greybeards' practice of treating the voice as an act of worship, using it explicitly to honor and acknowledge Kyne, to reach toward the divine rather than toward mortal goals, is an attempt to restore the gift to its proper relationship with its origin. Not to make the thu'um weaker by limiting it, to make it more true, to use it in a way that is aligned with the nature of what it actually is. The throat of the world, being Kyne's sacred mountain, is part of this. The Greybeards don't just happen to live on the highest mountain available. They live on the specific mountain where Kyne breathed humanity into existence, where her presence is most palpable, where the divine origin of the voice is most locally concentrated. Every meditation they do at High Hrothgar is done in the most appropriate possible physical relationship to the source of what they're meditating about. This is good theology, actually, in the sense that it has internal coherence and genuine depth. The Greybeards have thought through what they believe and built a life and a practice that is genuinely consistent with those beliefs. They're not just saying the right words. They are trying every day, in the silence and the cold and the discipline, to actually live what they claim is true. Most of us, if we're honest, fall considerably short of that. Section 24. The last thing's meditation on what remains. Every night ends. The mountain keeps standing. When Alduin was finally defeated, when the last Dragonborn stood in Sovngarde and used the Dragonren shout and faced the World Eater in his own conquered afterlife, the Greybeards were not there. They didn't go to Sovngarde. They didn't participate in the final confrontation. They stayed where they always stay. But they were involved. Without the training they provided, the Dragonborn would have arrived at the crisis less prepared. Without their connection to Paarthurnax, the Dragonborn would never have reached the summit of the throat of the world or learned what was waiting there. Without the philosophy, they carry the insistence on using the voice with genuine internal alignment rather than brute force. The specific shouts needed to face Alduin might not have worked as needed. The Greybeards' contribution to the defeat of the World Eater was precisely the kind of contribution the Greybeards make. Indirect, quiet, concerned with the quality of what someone is, rather than with the visible actions they take. They shape the Dragonborn not by fighting alongside them, but by creating the conditions in which the Dragonborn could be what they needed to be. This is the long game. This is the thing that philosophies and traditions and practices of contemplation do, that armies and political movements generally cannot. They prepare, they deepen. They cultivate in the present the capacities that will be needed in a future they may not be able to predict specifically, but know will come. Jurgen Windcaller spent 7 years in silence, developing a philosophy he knew wouldn't be fully appreciated in his own lifetime. He was building for a future he couldn't see, knowing that the effort would compound over time in ways that single acts of power never could. The Greybeards, who came after him, each one, in their own way, extending that vision, were doing the same thing. Not for immediate results, for what comes after the immediate. And now, after the Dragon Crisis, after the last Dragonborn's defeat of Alduin and the dispersal of the Dragon threat, the world continues. The Civil War will resolve itself one way or another. The Thalmor will continue their long-game strategy against human nations. New crises will emerge, as they always do. The throat of the world will keep standing, and the snow at its summit will keep not melting, and the wind will keep working at the stone walls of High Hrothgar. And somewhere in those halls, the 4 remaining human Greybeards will keep meditating. Arngeir, the eldest and most controlled, still the only one who speaks freely. Bori and Wulfgar and Einarth, their voices too saturated with power for casual conversation, communicating through presence and gesture, and the occasional word that shakes the walls when they choose to speak it. And above them, at the absolute summit, Paarthurnax sits, ancient and patient and honest about his nature, wrestling with what he was, choosing repeatedly what he wants to be. Looking out over Skyrim with eyes that have watched this land change 1,000 times and will watch it change 1,000 more. The wind, which might be Kind's breath or might just be wind, moves through the valleys. The last pine trees at the tree line bend and recover and bend again. A pilgrim, somewhere on the 7,000 steps, stops to read an inscription on a stone tablet and thinks, perhaps for the first time, about what it would mean to actually understand a word, not just its definition, but its weight, its cosmological truth, the thing it names from the inside. The mountain doesn't care about the Civil War. It doesn't care about the Thalmor or the Empire or the politics of any particular era. It has been here since before the Dragon Lords, and it will be here after whatever comes next. The Greybeards have understood this from the beginning. They built their home on something that doesn't change at the same rate as human arrangements, and they oriented their practice toward questions that don't expire when the political landscape shifts. What is the voice? What does it mean to use a divine gift in a way that honors its origin? What does it feel like to carry something enormous and treat it with the gentleness it deserves? What is better, to be born good, or to overcome your evil nature through great effort? These questions were old when Jurgen Windcaller was young. They'll be old when the last of the current Greybeards is gone. And whoever comes next to the mountain, whoever climbs those steps with genuine intention and arrives at the gray stone walls and feels the resonance of the place, will find those questions waiting. Patient, as always, ready to receive whatever contemplation the new arrival can bring. The door to High Hrothgar has never been locked. The Greybeards have never turned away someone with genuine intention and real talent for the voice. The institution is small, and the practice is hard, and the silence is enormous and sometimes lonely. But the door is always open. That, maybe, is the most underrated thing about the Greybeards. In a province full of exclusive organizations, guilds with initiation rituals, orders with heritage requirements, brotherhoods with loyalty tests, the Greybeards simply say, if the voice is in you, and you want to do the work, come. The mountain is big enough. The silence is deep enough. The questions are inexhaustible. Come sit with us for a while.